I think the very phrase free will is problematic when people have an idea of what they think that means, and that's uh, can undermine the conversation from the get-go. But basically, from the tradition I study, the understanding is like this: there's no such thing as personal free will or individual free will because there's no such thing as person except as a mental construct. What there is an organism, a body mind organism, and that body mind organism is spontaneously doing whatever it does. It's carrying out its genetic programming and its psychological programming. um, and and what we do is we tell a story after the fact, an egoic story. I did this, or I chose that, and it's a story told immediately after the fact, that makes sense only when that thought is unreflectively believed. You just assume the thought to be true, and therefore it seems to be true. But at the same time, this tradition says, that mind at large, or the one consciousness, is, as it were, nothing but free will. And that is to say, it freely manifests a universe of experience with its full range of possibilities, because it sort of metaphorically wants to experience that full range of possibilities. And here we run into problems with language because, wanting, from the human point of view, most people, you think of something that might be possible and then you want it. It's preceded by some sort of cognition of a possibility. But here, according to this traditional view on the universal consciousness, there's not a kind of thought and then a decision to act on that thought, but nonetheless, will is involved. Will in a very fundamental precognitive sense, that the one consciousness wills a universe of experience into being with the range of possibilities that this universe has, and perhaps other universes have other ranges of possibility, and that is free and willed. But it's the individual organism, um, insofar as it takes itself to be a separate person, a ghost in the machine, something somehow outside of the causality that governs everything else. That imagined person doesn't have free will, precisely because a thought cannot have will. It's just a thought. What do you think about that way of saying it?
I think extensive personal free will requires a person to truly exist as an entity, and it is not an entity separate from its environment. So personal free will is a very precarious concept to begin with. Where is that this distinct entity that we are talking about? It's like saying that the whirlpool has free will. Well, the whirlpool is just a name that we give to a particular behavior of the river. It's not a thing. So it cannot have free will because it's not there to begin with. It's an identifiable pattern of behavior that you can delineate, but it's not a separate entity with an agency of its own. In the same way, I think people are like whirlpools. There is nothing to people but nature. People are doings of nature. People are something nature is doing, not an agent separate from nature that can in turn define its own actions, because that agent is itself a doing. So how can it be free to do beyond the thing that does it? it,
Exactly.
it can't. But I
Exactly.
think the red herring of free will go even beyond that. Even if we you know get rid of this illusion of separateness, and we understand that people are not separate entities but doings of nature, actions of nature, and we say, okay, the only thing that truly exists is nature as a whole. Even then, to speak of free will is it creates a semantic distinction that has no correspondence in reality. Specifically, um, when we say that we choose out of our will, what we're trying to do is to contrast that with choosing out of necessity. So if there is a necessity for me to choose as I do, then I'm not free to choose. I'm only free to choose if I can choose in spite of and contrary to whatever necessities obtain, whatever necessities are the case in nature. But if the entity we are talking about is nature as a whole and there is nothing outside of it, then whatever it chooses is determined by what it is. And then the difference between will and necessity completely disappears. What nature must do is what it necessitates to do, because it is what it is and not something else. But that necessity expresses itself subjectively, qualitatively, as the irresistible will to do what is necessitated. In other words, the expression of the necessity is the will. And the will is the necessity. There is no distinction between the two. What nature does is what it must do. And what it must do is what it irresistibly wants to do. The wanting is the necessity. The necessity is the wanting. So the whole discussion about free will, it loses its semantic grounding because it's founded on this semantic distinction between necessity and will, when this distinction is illogical. There is no space for this distinction. So even to speak of universal free will, but it's free in relation to what? The universe is the sum total of everything that is the case. Whatever the universe is, what it does is a function of what it is. So
Yeah,
the necessity is what it wills, because the universe is qualitative in essence, and the will is the necessity.
totally agree. Totally agree. And this is the same view. It's just that and this maybe gets too spiritual, but when people ask in the context of this tradition I'm talking from, why is there something rather than nothing? The answer is will, the inherent will of the one consciousness. And that, of course, is not necessarily a satisfying answer for some people, but otherwise it's exactly as you said. But this kind of other element is introduced of bliss or joy, that the one consciousness joyfully does or wants to do exactly what is necessary, what is necessitated by the constitution of its own being, which of course is the totality of the universe.
Yeah, I think the word will is appropriate. It's just when we say free will that we are creating a semantic distinction that has no ground in reality. But
Right.
the word will is appropriate, like Schopenhauer used it, because you see, we can model nature as one field of subjectivity, and we can model experience as the different patterns of excitation of this one field, just like different ripples and whirlpools are different patterns of excitation of the lake. There is nothing to ripples and whirlpool but the lake, in the same way that there is nothing to experience but this one field of subjectivity. There is only the one field of subjectivity. So multiplicity arises out of the different possible patterns of excitation of that unitary thing, the one field of subjectivity. Now you could say, what is it that provides an impetus to that field to self-excite, to move, to vibrate, to behave in some way, as opposed to staying at absolute rest, like a lake without ripples? Well, you could call that impetus the will, the inherent will of that field of subjectivity. It inherently desires something in some sense. And it is that power of will that leads to its own self-excitations, and therefore to the phantasmagoria of existence, to the plethora of varied experiences that constitute what is. So to speak of will is good. It's the moment we talk about free will that we incur in in some semantic issues, because free in relation to what? It's the will of the one thing that exists. So in what
Yeah.
sense uh, can we justify an extra qualifier and say that it's free? I mean, if there
Yeah.
were something beyond nature, then nature could be constrained by the necessities of this something else. But we define nature as the sum total of what is, So there is nothing external to it to impose anything. So the qualifier free becomes unnecessary and confusing. But will isn't. Will is fine. Will is the impetus for the excitations, I think.
Yeah, beautifully said. And we get some of the same terminology in this tradition. Even this word excitation to talk about how nothing becomes something. In other words, consciousness in its potential form, unmanifest, pure potential, becoming phenomena. They describe it with that Sanskrit equivalent of the word excitation.
Hey, if you want to join these conversations and the Q&As that follow them live, you can find us at adventuresinawareness.com.